Today, I talk and answer the question, how does experimental filmmaking differ from mainstream Hollywood filmmaking? I'll introduce avant-garde's history and qualities that define its style. First, taking a look at the very first experimental film. Moving on to the mainstream Hollywood's history and conventions surrounding it. Then transitioning into how mainstream sometimes copies experimental visuals to make a more appealing film. Avant-garde was originally a part of the art world and was involved in art movements like Dada, Surrealism, Constructivism, Expressionism, and Still. These movements inspired a love, hate, rejection, and embrace for the art avant-garde throughout the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, as first witnessed in the form of French paintings. Through new innovation of film equipment, a generation has grown up to whom the motion picture is a creative medium as the other, older, more well-established arts. This new form of creative medium sprung the beginning of which, for the first time in its short history, with a group of creators unprejudiced by theatrical conventions and other distorting preconceptions of film, could unlock new avenues that would later become known as experimental or avant-garde in cinema. In the 1920s, avant-garde was mostly popularized and dominated by German films by Hans Richmer, Walter Ruttmann, Oskar Fincher, and Viking Iglian, who were inspired and motivated by paintings, graphics, music, and the period's general air of experimentation. This led to one of the very first avant-garde films being created, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a 1920 German silent horror, directed by Robert Nguyen and written by Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayer. Avant-garde films allow more people to invest in film because it may be made on the most slender of personal budgets and at the same time with a minimal of compromise. This adds to the experimental film's charm, character, and appeal. The experimental film's restriction of means has served as a kind of challenge to ingenuity and powers of invention. With that, experimental film is a vice for the creative expression rather than being tied to realistic modern cinema with its rules and conventions. However, the mainstream Hollywood cinema we see today began with the silent era film that started in 1895 and roughly ended around 1929. It was the start of new development in film technologies, culture, genres, and the classic star and studio system of which is very similar to today's standing. Hollywood achieved dominance as it established the practices and formulas that carried into the classical period. Conventions of mainstream films are dictated by the need to arouse and sustain our interest. They do this by conforming to the mainstream style continuity editing. The assumption is that the structure and style of any film will be invisible, allowing the viewer to enter and move into the story and the emotions of the characters. This is unlike the avant-garde style in which they want you to see what would be invisible to Hollywood. Avant-garde cinema may be understood in terms of responses to and reactions against mainstream cinema. Indeed, many critical accounts of the art cinema define its conventions as being opposite to Hollywood's. That's not to say that mainstream cinema doesn't find avant-garde important. There are many instances where mainstream tries to imitate and incorporate the experimental. Mainstream movies with experimental twists like Tron, 1982, Dune, 1984, 12 Monkeys, 1995, Fight Club, 1999, Poor Things, 2023, and so many more mainly use Hollywood's story and character arcs and experimental film's symbolism and confronting editing style to blend the two. Many of these films do surprisingly well in the box office because they break the normal rules and conventions that tie mainstream creators from unleashing unlimited creative freedom. Tron, a multi-million-dollar success and one of Disney's highest-grossing live-action film for 5 years, used its powerful storyline and outstanding visual prowess to reach new heights in the industry.
Trapped in inside an electronic arena where love and escape do not compute.
To review, avant-garde, originally an art form transformed from the canvas to the screen, allowed for new development of creative freedom and expression shown in extravagant ways that are now called the experimental. While on the other hand, Hollywood's mainstream started with the silent era of film that grounded the foundations of the rules and conventions now portrayed in today's modern Hollywood. But what connects the two seamlessly opposing forces is when Hollywood tries to incorporate the experimental by blending mainstream stories and the experimental visuals into an interesting dynamic that proves to be a successful outcome.